Today, we're going to unpack one of the biggest stories in modern aviation history, the crisis that literally brought the Boeing 737 MAX to a dead stop. It's a really complex story, about technology, about tragedy, and about a search for answers that shook the entire industry.
The whole thing, this entire crisis, really starts with just one number: 346. That's how many people, passengers and crew, were lost in two separate but terrifyingly similar plane crashes. And they happened just 5 months apart. Both planes were brand new Boeing 737 MAXs. When it looked like these two tragedies might be connected, well, regulators had to do something pretty extraordinary. They grounded the entire 737 MAX fleet, which kicked off this huge global investigation to figure out what went so wrong. So, let's start at the beginning. How did the world's best-selling airplane end up stuck on the tarmac? Let's walk through the events that led to a complete shutdown.
So, it all kicks off in October 2018. Lion Air 610 goes down. The FAA, they issue an emergency directive, but obviously it wasn't enough. Because just 5 months later, March 2019, Ethiopian Airlines 302 crashes in an almost identical way. Once satellite data linked the two disasters, the clock was ticking. Just a few days later, the FAA made the call and grounded the entire fleet. As the investigators started digging in, one acronym kept coming up again and again. It was for a piece of flight control software that, get this, almost nobody, including a lot of the pilots, had even heard of before.
So, what exactly was this mysterious system that was suddenly at the very center of this massive crisis? MCAS. It stands for Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. A big, fancy name, but the idea was actually pretty simple. It was software designed to make the new 737 MAX handle just like the older 737s, even though it had these bigger, more powerful engines. So you can think of it like a little automated co-pilot, just quietly working in the background to keep the plane's nose from getting too high.
And right here, this is where you see the huge gap between what it was supposed to do and what actually happened. MCAS was meant to be this seamless background safety feature, but it had a catastrophic flaw. It relied on data from a single angle of attack sensor. That's the thing that measures the wing's angle against the air. If that one sensor went haywire, MCAS could just keep pushing the plane's nose down over and over, essentially trapping the pilots in a fight they couldn't win. So after months and months of investigation, the FAA came out and detailed exactly what design flaws had to be fixed before any MAX was allowed to fly again. The FAA's final report basically boiled it down to 3 critical failures. First, that deadly reliance on just one sensor. Second, the fact that the system could fire off again and again, making it almost impossible for the pilots to fight back. And third, a key warning light that was supposed to tell pilots the sensors disagreed, well, it wasn't even working on most of the planes. And that last point is, well, it's just astonishing. This AOA disagree alert, it was meant to be a standard feature. But because of a software issue, it only worked if an airline had paid extra for an optional upgrade package. I mean, think about that. A critical safety alert was basically hidden behind a paywall. Okay, so once the problems were identified, the focus shifted. And what followed was one of the most intense and closely watched return-to-service efforts in the history of aviation. So getting the MAX back in the sky meant a complete overhaul. First, they redesigned the software. MCAS would now use data from both AOA sensors, and it could only activate once. Then, every single grounded plane had to go through physical sensor tests. Pilot training was totally rewritten to include simulator time on how to handle MCAS failures. And, crucially, all of this was checked and validated by international regulators to try and rebuild that global trust. This entire massive effort was all done within the FAA's official safety process, which you can kind of see laid out here. It's a system designed to assess risks and then mandate fixes. The 737 MAX crisis really put this whole process to the ultimate test, and it forced a review of not just the plane, but of the very system that approved it in the first place. The grounding of the 737 MAX brought up some really deep questions that went way beyond just a piece of software. It really got to the heart of the relationship between the people who make the planes and the people who regulate them. Some of the harshest criticism actually came from inside the system. A former FAA engineer, G. Michael Collins, he told Congress pretty bluntly that he felt the FAA had given way too much of its certification power over to Boeing, which raised all these questions about a potential conflict of interest.
But the FAA, they defended the system, saying that this kind of delegation has been standard practice for decades and it's necessary. The administrator at the time, Stephen Dixon, he admitted that improvements were needed, but he argued the basic model was sound.
But maybe the most shocking piece of this whole story came from an internal FAA risk analysis. And listen to this. It was done after the Lion Air crash, but before the Ethiopian Airlines crash. The analysis predicted that if MCAS wasn't fixed, the world could see as many as 15 more fatal crashes. Yeah, just let that sink in. The FAA's own data projected up to 15 more fatal crashes over the entire life of the MAX fleet. And while they did issue that first directive, this internal document really showed the true scale of the risk they were up against. And that right there leads us to the final, big, lingering question. The 737 MAX is flying again, sure, and it has multiple new layers of safety protection, but the debate is still raging over whether the regulatory system that certified the plane in the first place has been truly reformed to make sure a crisis like this can never, ever happen again.